Hello and welcome. I'm Suyash Rai from Carnegie, India. In today's seminar, we will talk about a new book that Professor Bann Seng Tan of Ashoka University has written. The book is about international aid and democracy promotion, and it's about liberalization at the margins. This book comes at a very crucial time for this topic because in recent years, we have seen many serious questions being raised about the future of democracy aid in particular, but also about the role that external pressures play in shaping margins. If those of you who remember or read about that period in the early 90s and even until the early 2000s, there was a certain kind of optimism or triumphalism about democracy and the promotion of democracy. The Soviet Union had fallen. The third wave of democracy was basically accelerating at a very rapid pace in the 90s. And as a consequence, many people thought that democracy is the only game in town. It seemed like a reasonable assumption around that time. But another assumption was made is that if you put in some effort through aid and other measures, you will accelerate this process of democratization and you can do something to help countries become more democratic. Now, over time, experience has shown the outcomes of that period, and it seems that the gains were actually much more modest. First of all, it seems that many of the donor countries in the West, which were the primary movers in this game, were actually interested in other objectives much more than democratization objective. So the commercial and strategic objectives were far more important, and often very key important bargains were made. The game was much more strategic than idealistic as in the way it was framed early on. Also, the recipients behaved strategically, and many of them were able to game the system in a manner that genuine gains for democratization were not made. And perhaps as a consequence of that, from 2010 onwards, we've seen also a steady decline in the total aid that is going towards democracy promotion. In real terms, although in nominal terms it looks like it's holding, but in real terms it's been falling. And also, if you look at the outcome, democracy, whether it's spread of democracy has happened over the last decade, more than a decade, there's not been much gain in democratization process. On the whole, the democracy index hasn't moved much, or in fact, it's fallen a little. And if you have been following this for the last couple of weeks, there have been a few reports that came out from VDEM Institute and all, which show that this process is further intensifying. So it's not just that the wave has crested, that there's also a serious ebbing going on. And I enjoyed reading this book a lot because it takes a very hard-nosed look at the experience of democracy promotion, democracy aid over the last several decades, during the Cold War, post-Cold War, and it does not assume a romantic view of the donor or the recipient. It takes a realistic view, it takes the data into account, and then frames its arguments about what could be done. And therefore, liberalization at the margins, because it seems like a marginal strategy might work better than other strategies. And we will hear from Professor Bann Seng Tan about the arguments in the book. And we are also joined by two speakers, discussants for the book, who will give comments on the book. Professor Bruce Bueno de Mesquita is a professor of political science at New York University. He actually provides a large part of the theoretical framework for the book also because of his selectorate theory, which he has worked on for many years. It is the theoretical underpinning for the book in a very important way. So it will be good to hear from him. Professor Liam Swiss of the Memorial University, Canada. He's a sociologist who has done a lot of work on foreign aid, politics of foreign aid from a Canadian perspective, but also broadly in terms of how aid plays a role in diffusion of values across the world. So it will be good to hear from him as well, his perspective on the book. The way we'll do it is that now I'll invite Professor Tan to give his book talk, and then I will request Professors Bueno de Mesquita and Swiss to give their comments on the book. After that, I'll give a few minutes to Professor Tan to respond to their comments if he wants to do that. And then we'll have about 15-20 minutes for an open discussion. So Professor Tan, may I now request you to give an overview of the arguments in the book?
Sure, thank you. I'm going to share screen now. Let me know if my screen, right? So let me know your time's up if you can see the full screen. Yes?
Yes. No, we can.
Okay, good. So I'm going to start. Good evening for the speakers in India, and of course, good morning from the speakers from North America, right? I take the opportunity to thank Carnegie India for the privilege to talk about the book. I'm grateful to my colleague Rudy for supporting the idea for this panel, and of course to the panelists and the hosts for their valuable time. I appreciate this a lot. Now, my overview, it has no stats, and I'll concentrate mostly on the argument. The book is on open access, so it's freely available online. I'm going to start by just talking about the international context behind the book. For some of us, this decade has been exhausting. The pandemic or the lockdown. I'm referring to the phenomena of resurgent authoritarianism and the feckless by liberal democracies. To those who care about liberal democracy, it seems like the liberal world order is collapsing, and the replacement seems to be an authoritarian world order. If, to use an expression from a popular TV series, if winter, there must be some who are wondering what is the future of democracy in a world that is systematically redesigned to be safe for autocracy. This book, right, the book that you see here, this book, right, is to our current darker age. It articulates a way forward in an international environment that is hostile to democracy promotion. Arguments in the book is not going to solve the crisis of liberal democracy, but it may buy some time for liberal democrats to get their act together. I want to understand in the book how the aid donors, the one with the money, choose among ones who need the money, whom to apply diplomatic pressure to. The reason why I want to study the dynamics of state bargaining in foreign aid is because I want to use the information in the service of democracy promotion. That is to say, the answer to the first question helps with the second question. I argue foreign aid can still be effective if we are selective in the choice. There should be a group of countries that lack the strategic and commercial attributes for reasons that I will go into. So this is the group that is more likely to liberalize. You care about this particular research. There are practical and theoretical considerations. Let's talk about the theory. First, I solve a problem that aid donors have. Since foreign aid is a bonus income for the regime, the recipients have an incentive to represent about their intention. So from the donor's point of view, it will be very useful for them if a priori they recipients who are sincere. So sincere means they say they want to liberalize, they actually mean it. From the recipient engage in cheap talk. Cheap talk means they say they want to liberalize, but they have no real intention of doing it. Furthermore, this is empirical, is quantitative. So this is going to be useful because it can be applied to other types of bargaining scenario between different practical implications to my research. Keep in mind the domestic politics within liberal democracies. We are living things in the age of austerity. COVID just makes it worse. National aid agencies such as the US Agency for International Development are under. By identifying the countries that are vulnerable to donor pressure, I'm helping the aid agencies achieve policy success. Domestic policy debates, and it affects the budget allocation. In other words, I help the aid agency buy their budgets. I'm going to start now by looking at the donor's point of view. The general public assume that foreign aid is motivated concern. So my internet was unstable, so I paused when it was unstable. I'm going to repeat. The general public assume that foreign aid is motivated by humanitarian concern. We know from empirical studies of those based on selectorate theory, that this is somewhat questionable as an assumption. Donors have a variety of objectives. They can seek geostrategic concessions. Think of US aid to ex-Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. United States was buying Egypt's compliance with the Camp David peace accord. So this idea of buying peace with Israel. Donors can also seek economic concessions. Think of Chinese aid to selected African countries that happens to be rich in the oil and mineral resources that happens to be needed by the Chinese economy. In fact, it's so well known, you can do a Google search for something called the Angolan model of aid giving. Of course, donors can seek democratization. My assumption, and this is one that is supported by the empirical literature, is that the economic and security interests are more important to the donors than that of democracy promotion. Now, I use the term and democratization somewhat interchangeably in the presentation. In the book, I distinguish between the two. So what's the difference? Democratization refers to fundamental political change that leads to a system of governance where the people are truly in charge. Are more superficial political reforms. They increase the accountability of the elites to the people. Political liberalization lead to a consolidation of democracy, aka rule by the people. Now, the empirical record from the donors show that when donors say they want democratization, what they really mean is political liberalization. They are happy to settle for a lesser goal. Just a visualization of the claim that donors have a variety of objectives. This is something you can find online, a simple Google search, US aid to Pakistan over time. Notice 3 time periods. During the Cold War, the United States, as part of its campaign to contain Soviet Union. So the United States give aid to Pakistan. After the Cold War, you notice that Pakistan has very little strategic value to the United States. Notice what happens to the aid to almost zero. United States cut off aid to Pakistan. This was true until around 2001, after the September 11th. Suddenly, United States increased its aid to Pakistan because it now needs Pakistan as part of its war on terror. What does this mean? This has very little to do with the developmental needs of the recipient. Pakistan is poor throughout each of the 3 periods. Aid it received varies. The inference is that the variation in aid is driven by the needs of the US for Pakistan. Now, just because we have donors that happen to want democratization, it doesn't mean the recipients will come. Recipients are strategic actors with imperatives of their own. That's why, in addition to the donors, in the book, I pay attention as well. So look at it from the recipient point of view. Well, what do they want? From the viewpoint of the leaders of an authoritarian country, democratization is politically costly, is painful. Autocrats do not want to give up power if they can help it. So what can they do? But they do not like the conditionality that comes with the aid. There are several possible responses, but the one I investigate in the book is the response of making a counter offer, giving up something that is valuable in exchange for the aid without democratization. The insight is to recognize that this is a bargaining scenario. The recipient with the strategic and commercial attributes that the donors want, easier time getting the aid compared to recipients who don't have this kind of value. So they may get the aid without democratization. Allow me to give two. Okay, the internet is an abstract argument. Allow me to give you 2 case studies. And these are case studies that are in the book. back in the year was a military coup in Egypt. General al-Sisi overthrew the elected government of Mohamed Morsi. Right? Immediately, the United States government came under pressure to cut off aid to Egypt in response. To give a context to my audience, there is a law automatically suspend all foreign aid to a recipient that suffers coup. Despite this law, the administration at that time was the Obama administration. They did not cut off aid. In fact, the Obama administration rhetorically refused to call what happened in Egypt a military coup. Because once you call it a coup, there's a legal obligation that I offer a contrast. Back in 2006, in Fiji, a Pacific island, there was also a military coup. The United States was decisive. It cut off foreign aid. It insists on democratization. Using the same law, it conspicuously implementing with regards to Egypt. Now, what can explain the disparity in the responses by the aid donor? To put it bluntly, it's too important for the United States to risk deportation. By contrast, United States have no particular need for Fiji. There, the United States can afford to indulge in a... My theory explains how the Western donors react differently between two groups of recipients. One group, you may help to think of them as the Egypts of the aid world. They have bargaining power. They can resist donor pressure. So statistical research, I'm going to call them the primary recipient. This is highlighted in red on the screen. The other group, think of them as the Fijis of the aid recipient world. They have very little bargaining power. They find it harder to resist donor pressure. I'm going to read recipients. I hope to have indicated or persuaded some in my audience that not all recipients promotion. We should filter the recipients by autocrats of primary recipients. They know they are valuable. They have leverage against the donors. Donor pressure against the primary recipients, according to the theory, are more likely to fail. However, the same pressure on secondary recipients just work. Now, why is that? Secondary recipients have little else to offer that is attractive to the donors. The autocrat less leverage. So therefore, this is the group that's more likely to liberalize with democracy aid. So the take-home audience is that we should calibrate our aid allocation strategy to emphasize the secondary recipients. If we want to be... This is why the subtitle of the book, right? That's why the subtitle of the book is called Liberalization at the... encapsulate the gist of my argument. Now that you know my main argument, the rest of the book is presenting the evidence. So using both quantitative and qualitative methods. Thank you so much for listening so far. I'm happy to take your questions and comments. Suyash, I yield the floor back to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Professor Tan, for that excellent overview of the argument. And I just want to second what you just said, that the book is much richer in detail and it's worth reading, especially the case studies and the quantitative work that has gone into it. If any of the attendees have questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A box that you can see below on the Zoom window. I now invite Professor Bueno de Mesquita to share his comments on the book.
Pleasure to be here. Really appreciate this opportunity. It's a wonderful book. I'm a deep pessimist about foreign aid, and this book really raised my hopes that foreign aid could be used for purposes other than keeping petty dictators in power and keeping their democratic donors in power. Or rather, while doing that, you could raise the petty dictator into something more desirable. The book poses something that we rarely see in the political science literature, and that is a really rigorously made argument that has direct practical implications. And I want to focus on some of the practical implications and pose some questions for Bann Seng Tan and others to think about, because this book has in fact made me very hopeful. It is clearly true, in a period of democratic contraction. I, however, am convinced, both theoretically and empirically, that for places like India that are mature democracies, that recession is just wiggle and not a real threat to democracy. And I think this book has some things to tell us in other places about that. In the case of India, I would just point out that in the 1970s, when Indira Gandhi was prime minister and attempted to radically revise the constitution, the country's score on various democracy ratings plummeted, and it came back. And it has recently dropped, not nearly as much as it did then during the Modi administration, and I'm a great believer that it will come back. So, some questions or some pondering. The book talks about the case of Myanmar, and the Myanmar case is really front and center today. That was less true as the book was being written, so it was quite a prescient case to choose. And I would be very interested to hear thoughts on whether Myanmar is a place where liberalization at the margins is a possibility. On the one hand, obviously we've just seen the military take control. On the other, I would make two observations. In my opinion, the Myanmar government was not particularly democratic. It was a lot better than the old military regime, but it had a long way to go. Second, among the types of regimes that evolve from authoritarian to more accountable, military regimes are front and center. Military regimes, for reasons I won't go into, theoretical reasons, have much stronger impetus to move in a liberalization direction than do rigged election autocracies, one-party states, and the like. So I would be curious, Bann Seng, particularly to hear your further thoughts as Myanmar has evolved. Another domain in which I'm interested in thinking now much longer term, not near term. I pondered in preparing for this, what sorts of circumstances would shift a state from being a primary aid recipient, a strategically attractive place or a commercially attractive place, into the potentially secondary type. And it seemed to me that the developments in energy technology are moving places, not now, but 15 years, 20 years down the road, are likely to convert petrostates, the resource curse states, into places that are awash in a resource that people will no longer be that keen to buy. So Venezuela can sustain a miserable government today, as long as it sells petroleum. And of course, much of the Middle East is able to do the same, and we can all come up with many other examples. As alternative energy replaces fossil fuel energy, as automobile manufacturers move increasingly towards electric vehicles that will be ultimately powered by wind, solar, etc. Are these then are these countries that down the road, not now, I understand, now we're still buying lots of petrol, but down the road, are these a wide swath of countries with a good prospect of needing economic assistance, because most of them so far are doing very little to diversify their economies. Certainly, Venezuela is doing very little to diversify its economy. Are these places that down the road will need aid and will be lacking in commercial value? Many of them are lacking in their current strategic value is only because they have petroleum. And when petroleum is no longer critical, they will no longer have that strategic value. Are these places for liberalization at the margin? And if they are, then is that a secondary reason beyond environmental concerns for a much greater push to hasten the transition away from fossil fuels as a mechanism to shore up democracy? We all understand leaders love autocratic government. It's great for them. They survive the first couple of years in office. They die in their sleep or don't get overthrown until they're ancient, like Robert Mugabe, or are believed to be terminally ill. But for people, autocracy is a terrible form of government. So is this yet another reason for us to be thinking about using democratization as a consequence of hastening energy transition? I don't want to go on too long. I just wanted to drive that point home. And I will close with the observation that among the many things about this book that are beautiful is that the case studies are they're not storytelling. They are being carefully used to probe what rigorous theory tells us to expect. So they are not aside from the theorizing, not aside from the quantitative evidence. They are informed by that. And so their function is to get to the nuance of the theory in the subtleties of individual circumstances, rather than, oh, but by the way, there are all these other things happening in these countries that explain this. It is test of theory, not storytelling. And I commend Bann Seng. That to me is exactly the way analysis should be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. You're absolutely right that one of the best mixed method treatments I've seen, at least in recent times, how to use both quantitative and qualitative evidence. And while doing the qualitative evidence, not to be opportunistic to make your argument to just sustain the theory somehow. It's a lot of discipline that has gone into writing paragraph after paragraph. And I congratulate Professor Tan for that. Professor Swiss, for your comments, please.
Thanks very much, Suyash. Thank you, Bann Seng and the Carnegie Endowment for including me in this session. It was a real pleasure to get the chance to speak to you this morning and to comment on a book that is such a pleasure to read. I think I'm going to echo some of Bruce's comments, in particular, the admiration for what I think is one of the best mixed methods studies I've read in quite a while, just in terms of the seamless integration of sophisticated quantitative analysis at the macro level with, as Bruce indicated, very detailed but theoretically informed and rigorously tested qualitative cases in the case of Myanmar, Egypt, and Fiji. So it's not often you get to read something in your area that kind of does what all, I think, scholars in this sort of field should aspire to, and kind of really strongly link both the qualitative and quantitative empirics to, test the theory. And Bann Seng Tan has done that with this book. So it's, I think, something that we can all aspire to. My comments, I think, are going to mostly take the form of questions that I was left with upon reading. And they're questions that we can either reflect upon, or maybe Bann Seng can try to address in response. But there a few things that I think this book raises that it could go further with. And so these are some of these questions, I think, that came to mind for me. One of the things that I thought was interesting in the book is that it sets out this notion of democracy promotion as being quite directive, and quite directive by donors in terms of, engaging in this bargaining with recipients and taking almost a quite coercive sort of approach to promoting democracy. And perspectives on norm diffusion globally, including the diffusion of democratization, sometimes debate about how such norms diffuse, and obviously coercive isomorphism is one of the key arguments here, is that we see similarities in democracy around the world because we're getting donors with power pushing those. And I think that, to me, strikes me as the argument that Bann Seng is taking in this book, is that the donors have a bit of a stick rather than they use the carrot and stick to try to promote democracy. And I wonder, in the model that the book puts forward, what room there might be for a more normative isomorphic argument. So the notion that it's not just through this heavy-duty bargaining and pressure on recipients to democratize that this and the sorts of aid attached to that that comes with that, and whether there is an argument that there's a less coercive way of doing this that doesn't involve the bargaining, doesn't necessarily involve as much strategic interest on the donor's part, but is simply the modeling and diffusion of different forms of institutional reform that might lead to liberalization in other ways. And I think part of this this question of whether there's room in this space for that sort of normative argument to emerge comes from my next question, which is question of, to which donors does this model best apply? Because I think in reading the book, it's quite clear that this book fits very well with the US story. The American sort of aid regime, I think, more than many DAC donors, is really intrinsically linked to strategic interest, commercial interest. If we step back, though, and maybe look at some middle power donors, like, well, my own country, Canada, or Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, these donors have neither the leverage nor the threat of force that a US has, obviously, in terms of their bargaining with recipients, right? So one of the questions that I had that I was curious to hear Bann Seng maybe reflect on is how well does this model work when we take kind of the superpower donor out of the mix, and we're left with a bunch of the sort of mid-range donors who maybe don't have, no matter how much aid they're providing, don't really have that sort of leverage with recipient countries in any event. So we're curious to reflect on that, because I think reading this as a Canadian and an expert on Canadian aid, some of what was being posited and quite clearly, I think, argued in the case of maybe China as a donor or the US as a donor, maybe didn't ring as true for a smaller country with less to bring to the table in terms of aid, but also less sway in terms of global political power. The third question I was left with at reading through the book was, you really make an excellent job of kind of underscoring recipient salience and the extent to which your primary and your secondary recipient groups are treated quite differently by the donors in both the quantitative analysis and in your case studies. I was left puzzled though about the middle group of donors, those of recipients, those recipients that were neither in the primary group nor in the secondary group. They were the ones that had some, maybe some commercial interests, maybe some strategic interests, but weren't at the bottom of the pack. Because it seemed to me that in a lot of your quantitative models, that middle group actually made out almost as well as the secondary group of recipients that you highlighted, so that there was still some positive gains in terms of liberalization and everything that you put there. And that I thought was quite interesting, because if that's the case, then your liberalization from the margins might be reinterpreted to be liberalization everywhere except the people who can tell us to take off, right? It's like, liberalization is possible in all the places except those recipients who can, say to the donor, we don't care what you say, we're not going to do it, right? So I was curious to have your reflection, maybe a little reflection on that, about how your dichotomy of primary versus secondary actually incorporates that middle group that I almost wanted to call it the semi-periphery, like the world systems theory in me was calling it, but it's not really that. But it had some aspects of both primary and secondary, obviously. And curious too, because looking at your list of primary and secondary donors on page 153, it's quite clear to me, at least, that a lot of that seems to really closely just map onto income category. So a lot of the primary donors are middle and upper middle income countries, and a lot of the secondary recipients are a lot of low and low income countries. So curious about are there other distinctions there that we can draw? Can we find strong examples of a middle income country that's in that secondary donor or secondary recipient category that kind of maybe takes takes away from that split, at least that seemed immediately apparent, of kind of income as a driver here. Finally, just a couple other small questions that came up, I think that I was interested in reflecting on a bit more, was about the influence of global dynamics. A lot of my research on aid donors and their behaviors is about how they reflect global agendas and how they work to spread global institutional frameworks and policy models. And one of the things that I was left wondering about is whether and how this democracy promotion piece being maybe a bit deprioritized in recent years, how much that has to do with how well it's reflected in global agendas. So if we look at the SDGs, for instance, SDG 16 touches upon issues of this, but it doesn't ever really go so far as to say we're directly aiming to promote democratization around the world. And clearly at the UN, you couldn't put through a set of goals that would appease all members of the UN that would be so blatantly, So I wonder a bit more about the role of the SDGs and global donor agendas and kind of shaping some of these responses over time. And then just a couple other small questions. One was obviously the data that you're working with is primarily, it's an older aid data set that is primarily DAC based, Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, for those it's development. We throw these acronyms around like crazy, right? But I liked in the Myanmar case study that we see China and I get the sense you're ascribing many of the same donor preference characteristics to China, but obviously democratization is not one of those characteristics. So that, I wonder how well we can assume that China behaves as all other donors in the global and regional context, but maybe not on the issue of democracy, but maybe in terms of other areas. So I'd be interested just to see, how well you think the donor role you ascribe to donors in this book maybe maps onto China and other emerging donors in the global south. So I think that's it. I had a question about how your arguments here can kind of help explain the recent coup in Burma as well. And Bruce has already raised that. So I'd be very interested to hear you reflect a little bit on that, because as I was reading that chapter, I was just trying to think in my mind about, how aid has maybe played or not played a role in what we've just seen recently in Myanmar. So I think I'll leave my questions there, and I'm very happy to hear you discuss any of this. As I said, it was a real pleasure getting a chance to go through this study, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on it.
Thank you, Professor Suyash. If you don't mind, Professor Tan, I would like to add a couple of questions just to this long list of questions to
Sure.
use my privilege as a moderator. And maybe you can take these questions in one bunch and then we can go to the audience. I haven't got any audience question as of now, but there should be a few minutes. So first question is about China again. I think this has come up in different ways in the context of Myanmar already. But also in terms of your research that shows that during the Soviet era, the impact on secondary recipients was less because they could do donor shopping relatively easily. They could go to Soviet Union if they were in a bind where they didn't offer much of strategic or commercial value, and they were under pressure to democratize from some Western donor, primarily United States, I assume, or any of the OECD DAC members. So they could go, and therefore impact was less. So in the last few years, China's assertiveness has increased, and it's not Soviet Union. It is not trying to promote a particular regime type. I don't know whether it is. I don't know whether it will eventually, what its grand strategy is, but it is looking for allies. It is looking for allies across the world. It is looking for people, countries that are beholden to it in some way or the other. And how might this change the efficacy of the strategy that you have proposed? Although, of course, on the margins, it may still have an impact wherever the actual ability to go to China, as you argued in the Myanmar chapter, is less. But as we see in the Myanmar case study, perhaps there is greater opportunity in that direction than we had previously assumed. Right? China aid kitty is growing very rapidly, and it is going to match the United States very soon in just its volume, and it could become a serious competition on this. A flip side of this question is about a normative question about how should this contest, so-called strategic contest in the US and China, be framed. I'm reminded of Walter Lippmann's critique of the Truman Doctrine, that if you want to defend democracy everywhere, it means defending any democracy of any kind. Then the whole normative view of promoting democracy as such goes out of the window, whether it's the Greek democracy in the late 40s or whatever, you have to defend it. So if it gets framed in that way, what would be the consequences for this whole democracy promotion agenda itself? Or how should it be framed in the normative question in your view, based on your research? So, and one comment on the empirical strategy, specifically on the commercial value that the countries offer. You use the past data on export, import, especially in size of the economy, to do the analysis of the impact later on. But if you're looking for the future strategic value, it is the potential growth that you get in trade, for example, which is more important. Because if you're already a big part of my trade kitty, that means that problems have already been solved. And if you are actually a smaller size than theory predicts, then you would be looking for, bargaining with those countries to open up so that they allow you to export or import more into their countries, which is a missed opportunity by this strategic empirical strategy. So I'd be keen to know why you took that strategy. Thank you.
For both my panelists and the host, I'm writing down. I see more than 12 questions. It's a lot to handle. So what I'm going to do, instead of answering one by one because it will take the whole time, I'm going to group them into teams, right? So Liam has one particular team where they talk. Liam's question, where he talks about the issue of middle range power, middle range in both the recipients and middle range in both of the donors. And how does that speak to countries like Canada, and in this case of what Suyash, in the case of China, what about those donors that don't seem to play by the rules of the Western DEC framework, right? Let me make a few points. First general point is that it is true for the purpose of illustrating and testing the theory, I purposely focus on the ideal types. So the ideal type of a primary, ideal type of recipient. It's also true that there's a lot of countries in the middle. So when in this book, I treat them in a more agnostic category, right? That is, my theory doesn't make a strong prediction because some donors may care about strategic value, some donors may care about commercial value. This is where the case studies or more nuanced data will be very. To the other point, in the last chapter of the book, I speculated a little bit about where this research can proceed. I explicitly make an appeal if the donors have proprietary data. That means they have very on how much they actually value a particular recipient based on their own internal foreign ministry or trade ministry research. Obviously, they can come up with a much better list of mapping of how much they actually value certain countries. So obviously, in other words, with better data, then you will have better predictions, and with better predictions, you can make a much better policy prescription. I have a section where I talk a little bit about Chinese foreign aid. So there's a lot of debate about this, right? So in the my internet was unstable, so I paused when I wait for it. I mentioned with regards to the Chinese data that there's a lot of rhetorical claims about Chinese foreign aid, and that actual concrete information aid is an issue that is heavily contested. So we could speculate, right? But the social scientists in that it will be much better if we get proper data. Then we are no longer speculating. Unfortunately, as far as we know, not exactly cooperating with such data. Some of the aid data, when they try to extrapolate Chinese foreign aid, are not actually using direct information from China. They are looking from the web. They are extrapolating and working backwards on what they think China is doing. So don't get me wrong, this is something that is commendable. It's the best we can do, we can work with, but eventually when we get better data, we should be able to come up with a better set of information. Now, the other point so that's the first theme. The other theme I want to make issue of Myanmar, which I think I should wait for it because that's the Myanmar case seems to be very popular now because of what happened. And all three of you have mentioned this. But I want to respond to Bruce's point where he speculated about a future research direction. Links this very intricately to this idea of the long-term change in the recipient status. And I'm not being defensive here, right? In the book, what I have at most is a model of recipient political liberalization, and it's not a very sophisticated model. What Bruce is speculating is a model of salience transition. How do they become primary over time? It's a much bigger question, as you can imagine. And then he speculated that maybe as oil become less and some other type of recipients will raise to prominence concurrent with the fall of the petrol states and so on, right? That could be it. And when he said that, I was immediately thinking about some countries seems to have made a strategic decision to invest into cryptocurrencies, maybe as a way of diversifying their economies. And I couldn't help but notice that some of these countries that specialize in cryptocurrency also happens to be the countries under Western sanctions and so on. They are the ones that are more desperate to get out of the Western hegemony. Now, this is interesting because Bruce linked it to this idea that there might be an environmental reason, or this idea that with the change to green energy, some countries may be. He links it in one direction. I'm linking it in the opposite direction, that some of the cryptocurrencies we now are extremely energy intensive. Apparently, it takes a lot of energy to mine for Bitcoins and so on. Now, I'm not an expert in this. That certain countries where either because of the environment, that means they are in the north, which means that easier, which means that certain countries where it's cheaper to mine for Bitcoins might become more important or major. So this is just speculation, right? Because I'm definitely not an expert in this region, but this will be something a policymaker planning 20, 50 years from now might want to look into it, right? That I don't know, maybe Iceland could be an interesting country to pay more attention to, simply because it's easier, or not is easier is wrong word. It's simply because they have a comparative advantage in the cooling when they are mining for Bitcoins. So if you want to have a sense of where these kind of countries are, look at where Microsoft and Google are investing in the next generation of computer servers. Those are probably the correct countries. I don't know, because I'm not an expert in this area. Right? So that is one way to think about this. Now, one more point, I want to be quick about this. Bruce talked about this idea of military regimes and so there is already a model about this, where they talk about how during the Cold War, military coups tend to lead to democratization. After the during the Cold War, because donors, recipients can play the Soviet Union against the United States, so they can play one camp against the military coups do not lead to democratic transition. After the Cold War, it's supposed to be easier for the West because the Soviet collapse, so the recipients can no longer play the West against the Soviet Union. And there is an argument now with the rise of China that has resurfaced. Now the recipients can play the Chinese against the West. So, okay, so the internet went back on again, right? So that could be the case, and that in the case study on, I talk about donor switching. I pointed out there is an intrinsic limit to donor switching because the alternative patron logically seeks to get or extract as much out of the recipient as possible. And if the alternative patron is, they may demand so much that the recipient may donor switch back to the West. So the case of Myanmar back in the case study. Now the Myanmar case, I'm going to now address this. I'm going to make a first point. Just be aware that the book, the research for the case study was done in 2015. That was about 5 years ago. So a lot has changed in 5 years. I just want to point out that the Chinese are very uncomfortable about what right now, because Aung San Suu Kyi, after she has alienated the West over the Rohingya issue, she tried to balance with the sanctions of the West by being more friendly with the Chinese regime. So she invited Xi Jinping to go and visit Myanmar, which is fine, except that I think the act of doing so has increased the fear of the Tatmadaw, which is the Burmese junta. The junta is actually very wary of increased Chinese influence over Myanmar. I don't know if that's one of the key reasons for the coup, but it might be one of the potential contributing reasons. So in other words, the Chinese are in a bind with regards. On the one hand, they don't want Western interference into Myanmar, but on the other hand, if they were given a free choice between Suu Kyi's government and the current military junta, they actually prefer Aung San Suu Kyi's government, which is somewhat ironic. I should also point out right now what's happening on the ground. The resentment of the Burmese population against China is actually quite high, so that the Chinese side had to deny that they were supporting the coup, right? Yeah, there's a lot of conspiracy theories in Myanmar right now. So my point, situation is ongoing. It's not a clear-cut case of China serving as an exit option for Myanmar. I think the junta is quite wary about Chinese influence over Myanmar. So that is one concern I have. Now, right, so well, this is a big point, right? This has to do with Myanmar, right? It's not clear right now why the one. There are several speculated answers. The reason why it's not clear is because under 2008 constitution, the junta is effectively in charge. The National League for Democracy, the NLD, right, is more or less is for all intents and purposes already autonomous. So for the purpose of understanding why launch a coup now, one important question analysts have to ask is that why would the junta launch a coup now when it is already effectively in charge, right? The constitution guarantees 25% of the seats to the army. The budget controlled by the army, not by the NLD government. The top leadership is appointed from within the army. That means the army doesn't have to listen to. One of the bigger puzzle, which I still don't have an answer to, is why launch a coup when you're already in charge? And until you understand that question, then we have a sense of how desperate or how resolved the regime is to stay in power, which will speak a lot about whether how the civil conflict will play out, right? Because right now it seems like both sides are entrenching, right? So I don't have a good answer about this, but there's a lot of speculation on the Burmese case right now. I'm going to stop here, and I apologize because I counted 12 questions, right? So I try to answer about 6 of them, because I think there are questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Bann Seng. Yeah, we did bombard you with many more questions than perhaps we should have. And fortunately, we don't have too many audience questions, so it's not like we are going to disappoint many people. There's one question from Hargun Sethi on Myanmar, but I think you've already answered that. So I don't think you need to take that again. It's about whether China will give more aid to Myanmar now to compete with the US. But as you said, its situation is not clear what the Chinese preference on this issue is going to be. So I think that's that. So we're almost out of time now, and I would like to again remind you all that this book is available for free or an open source content online. You can download and read it. It's a wonderful read, and it's especially for people who are into research. They can learn about how to deal with questions in a comprehensive manner, use theory, use empirics to test it, bring qualitative insights into understanding how the process through which these things work, and then perhaps say a word or two about the policy implications, because we do have a duty towards the society we live in. So, so it's great that, and do all of that in less than 200 pages. That's also very important, because I mean there are people who write very, very long books which take a lot of time to read. And if arguments can be made in fewer words, it's good to make it do it that way. So thank you, Professor Tan. Thank you, Professor Bueno de Mesquita and Professor Swiss, for joining us today and sharing your insights, questions, comments. And we look forward to doing more of these seminars. We do one of them at least once a month. Please join us for more of these. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Right?